You're listening to Conflict Radio on the Conflict Radio Network. Greetings, and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is October 20th, 2020, and we're going to have Jared Murphy join us along with Scotty Roberts. Jared, you there?
I am.
Okay, now, awesome we got you on. Jared Murphy is a self-experimenter and field researcher of ancient technologies and lost history. Jared Murphy has traveled the world searching for evidence of advanced and high technology. Would that sum you up, Jared?
That would be my intro, yes.
Yeah. And your book, It's Not Aliens, It's Us, is available on Amazon. You got your website ready yet?
Yes, it's not aliens. It's www.notaliens.com.
Awesome. And we're also going to have Scotty Roberts join us. Scott Roberts' background is laced with varied and diverse skills and experience. After 2 years in a Christian Bible college, he entered seminary pursuing his master's in divinity. During his college and seminary studies, he focused on his academic and personal passion for history, theater, and art. His religious studies intensified his interest in spirituality, and his research of the paranormal expanded throughout the 80s and 90s. Scott is the founder and publisher of INTREPID Magazine, a journal dedicated to politics, science, extraterrestrial contact, unexplained phenomena, and alternative fringe theories. His websites are intrepidmag.com and scottallenroberts.com. And we'll be back on Conflict Radio with both Jared Murphy and Scotty Roberts right after this. Well, welcome back to Conflict Radio. We've got Scotty Roberts with us from the Intrepid radio program, and we have Jared Murphy still with us. He was with us on the intro. How are you guys doing today?
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.
Same. Thanks for having us.
Jared, it's always great to have you on. Now, Scotty, I wanted to get you on because you've done some research into some things that our Jared and I's journey has led us to, and so we wanted to get you on to talk to you about reptilians, what they could be, and hello?
I'm here.
All right, I thought I heard talking in the background there, but
I did too.
But anyway, let's go with what you're doing, your books that you have on the reptilians and the Nephilim. What's going on out there?
Oh, you're asking me specifically?
Yeah, what do you think's going on?
Well, I will tell you what. I started most of my research into some of these things, the Nephilim, the reptilians, all of that kind of thing, really started out of, and this might seem kind of odd, and I don't know, maybe Jared, maybe you have dealt with some of this. It started in a crisis of faith. And I had lots of questions. When I was a young man, I was in Bible college, I was in seminary, I was in ministry, I was a youth pastor for a long time, very much in the evangelical, conservative, fundamentalist Baptist setting. And I started to have questions very early on. I had questions in seminary. I had questions with linguistics. Hey, Doc, you're telling us we have to believe this and this and this, and that words mean something, that linguistics means something, context means something. The context of the people who would have read the things that were written in their context needed to have context. I said, but I've got this question because we're teaching something that seems different than that. And I would ask my question, and I'd be told, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we don't talk about that stuff. Just go with the flow. Don't cause trouble. And it was always a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I never got in trouble for it, like you hear some people have those stories. But I never got satisfactory answers. And so I said, look, as time went on, that was in the early 1980s. And as time went on, I kept my questioning, and I kept running into brick walls. I stepped away from the church altogether. And I didn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, but I walked away from it. And I said, I've got to start exploring from outside the box. And so a lot of my work on looking into the Nephilim, it's steeped. That book that I wrote it in 2011, and it was published in 2012. So you're talking almost 10 years ago. I wrote the book, but I'd been ruminating on that book for several years prior to that. And when I wrote that book, there's a lot of biblical me that's expressed in that book. And I wrote a lot of it in first person. It's a not a fictional book. It's a non-fictional book. It's supposed to be a reference type book, a study book, a research book. But I did a lot of, now here's what I think about this. And I went off on pet peeves I had with certain elements of things. And so I wrote that book as really a reaction to crisis of faith, loss of faith, stepping away from faith. And I found in the process of that anything then that I mentioned that had any kind of a spiritual overtone or underpinning of any kind, I had to also then be very careful how I approached that stuff, because I said, look, if I'm going to turn away or reject one spirituality because I don't believe what it's telling me, I'm not just going to flip over and use some other spirituality or admit that something exists that is just as fanciful as anything else. And so I tried very hard to walk that thin line and straddle that fence, having feet in both worlds, trying to keep them in the academic world, a scholarly world, a scientific world, while at the same time trying to keep them in a spiritual, I couldn't say it was a Christian world anymore, a Judeo-Christian setting, you could almost have called it.
Yeah.
For a bland cover on it.
The Nephilim, they're from Nibiru, right?
Well, I don't think so. Not in the way I see it. Now, I know there are people out there that have theories that I don't adhere to. It doesn't mean I'm not intrigued by their theories.
You're talking about like the dark star that's on its way and has the planets that are evolving it, blah, blah, blah.
Right. Well, you're looking at kind of a point,
that back.
Yeah, you're looking at like a Zecharia Sitchin type of an approach, even though his is a much older approach now, because there's been a lot of newer research. But or a David Icke or people like that. I look at that stuff and I say, well, I went to the source point of the word Nephilim, which is a Hebrew word. It's a Hebrew word that's sourced in the Pentateuch, the writings of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. This is the source point of the word Nephilim, even though it's picked up in other places. Nephilim is a Hebrew word, nephal, with the him as a suffix put on the end to denote plurality. So the Nephilim, just like the Elohim. And so I started digging into this stuff from a biblical standpoint. Who are these characters mentioned in the Bible? And that's how I really got my start in all of the research on this, because the passage actually said, Genesis 6, it starts talking about, and in those days the sons of God descended and mingled with the daughters of men and had children by them. And it doesn't say offspring, it says, but the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. And what I found out of those 4 verses, obvious earmarks of having been lifted or edited from other source materials. And so you have to start looking to, okay, where did this original story come in? Where did it come from? And so I started digging into that. And then you've got what I didn't realize at the time. Having grown up in that faith, I was never taught until after my years in seminary, when I started doing my own research, that the whole Nephilim story was the preamble to the Noah's flood story in the book of Genesis. And I never even knew that. I had never made that connection. It was never taught as a connection. We were never even taught about Nephilim intermingling with human women and extraterrestrial or celestial beings. And that's where, remember I mentioned to you I had my first initial questions in seminary, and that was over linguistics. I said, hey, now this verse tells us, in English it reads, the sons of God came down and intermingled with the daughters of men. And I said, now, in the Hebrew it says, the B'nai Ha-Elohim came down and intermingled with the daughters, I don't remember the word for daughters, Adam, or of mankind. I said, there's a contrast here. I said, who are these guys? And I was told, the immediate answer I was given, oh, we know where you're going with that. We've heard this whack-a-mamie theory before. But all it really is it's the sons of the aristocrats who built the schools of the prophets. And their sons went down slumming in the valley, literally down into the valley, slumming amongst the common women, and married them. I said, oh, so it was a class thing you're telling me. And yes. And I said, well, then why does the language which you are teaching us here in this school, linguistics means something, context means something? I said, why does it then call the men, it calls them the Bnei Ha-Elohim, the sons of the God of many gods, when the women are called the daughters of Adam? They're humans. I said, why is that contrast there? And then that's when I was told, don't be a troublemaker, just, And so those are the kinds of questions that led me down a path of really, in the early 1980s, tacitly or reservedly looking into these things. And I really didn't leave the church until the mid-1990s. And so it was after that I really started digging in, trying to figure out what the hell is what.
What do you think the Nephilim are?
The Nephilim?
Yeah.
Well, I used to believe without any question that they were the offspring of what Genesis called the sons of God.
Well, so they're giants then?
Say that again?
So they're giants?
I think that was there was a bit of a mistranslation in there. I believe that there were giants that are attributed to, later in that same Genesis passage, it talks about the heroes of old and the men of renown. It's speaking of the Gibborim, these giant spirit, physical yet spirit beings that were part of Hebrew mythology. And so the question is, mythology, were they real beings that we built up that became legendary and became mythology? Or is it part of mythology just only in the sense that it's part of Hebrew spirituality? So there were these giant characters, but then there were the Nephilim, and they were said to be giants, and there are several references in the Old Testament that seem to relate Nephilim to giants. For instance, we all know the David and Goliath story. Well, they say that Goliath and his 3 brothers from Gath were remnants of the Nephilim. And you get the measurement for Goliath as being 6 cubits in a span, which is roughly 9 to 10 feet tall. So is that a giant? Yeah. Did they mean he was 9 to 10 feet tall with the tall Philistine headdress? With it, we don't know for sure. But it talks about the shaft of his spear being like a weaver's loom, the shaft of a weaver's loom, and that it was huge. And they talked about the weight of his armor and all of this stuff as to relating to his size. Oh, and by the way, if I can throw this in, just in my studies, and I talked about this in a totally different topic, I think it's very interesting. I think the story of David, the king, and David's encounter with the giant Goliath, that these are all it's all an apologetic about David. I kind of subtitled the talk that I gave on this as King David, the real life story of a fictional hero, is that he was created to be, because he was the first king of Israel, or the second king, the greatest known king of Israel, there was an apologetic of the day written about him. And we've got this story of David and Goliath, and yet in a different book in the Old Testament, we got the David and Goliath story in the book of, it's 1 Samuel, I think it is. Not 2 Samuel, 1 Samuel. But then in the book of Chronicles, which chronicles the Israelite kings in the Old Testament, you've got the same story of Goliath, but it talks about, and Elhanan the Bethlehemite slew Goliath and his brothers, and the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's rod. It uses some of the same lingo to describe his armor. And so the big question comes into play. Okay, who killed Goliath? Was it David, or was it one of his servants, Elhanan the Bethlehemite? Because in the passage, it's one little tiny verse, and Elhanan the Bethlehemite slew Goliath, and his shaft of his spear was blah, blah, blah. And it moves on to the next guy. It's like a bullet-pointed list of the deeds of David's mighty men. But it's not David writing it, it's not his apologist writers writing it. It's a different author. And so it's interesting. But back to the giant thing. The Nephilim, by definition, the word nephal means to fall, to descend, to come down, to leave one's estate. It's got that meaning to it. It could have been used to fall in battle, to trip down the stairs, to physically remove yourself from a greater position to a lesser one. That's what the word nephal means. And the im, put on the end, the him, is the suffix, plural. Those who fell, those who came down, those who did such and such. And that's all that Nephilim means by definition. So were they the giants? Well, there's other passages that seem to indicate, Og, the king Og, they found his bed, and his bed was like 10 feet long or something like that. And maybe he just had a big bed. Was he a giant? We don't know. We have no archaeological evidence to back that up.
Jared,
it's just a claim made in Scripture. So
do you
there
have
go.
anywhere to go, Jared?
Well, growing up severely Irish Catholic, I know your background.
There you go.
I mean, when your family's dad's in the choir, mom's in the contemporary group, edits the paper, got the full church group, the school group, you have church ski club and junior high ski club, and then you got the full on traditions of a multi-generational Catholic family. Yeah, I know the background, and that's the same questions. My minor, I went to school for music. I was going to play the violin seriously till I was 21. Nice. And then my minor was going to be in ancient Greek because I was sick of people's the questions that always came up right away. And I wrote about this too, is that the minute you have a question, you're told to either have more faith or nudge, nudge, don't ask the question. Right. Or, it's not relevant to you believing and, doubting Thomas. And if you can't shame them into it, then the questions that you sit down in these alleged groups, when somebody said, oh, there's a Bible study, do you want to go? And I'm like, great, I'm going to go learn about this. No. Yeah. You're going to learn the words in this fictional book that's been put together for you to have faith. You are not here to study the origins, the documentation, two-source theory. The two-source theory. Is it the Elohist? Is it the Yahwehist? Is it is it? What are the sayings of Jesus? What the hell is that? You don't get taught any of this in a religion where you're supposed to. It's supposed to be the greatest book ever. No, it's the greatest story ever edited together from a bunch of scraps.
Boom.
It's not about. All right, I digress. The point is,
I understand.
The Nephilim, when you're looking for an ancient high-tech human society, the first thing that happened, humans tell great stories. In the last 6,000 years, we've either mystified technology or stories that became legends, that became myths, that became deified. The reality is that the echoes and the slivers of our ancient past, the ones that are now underwater, the ones that are on a coastline that aren't above water right now, Doggerland in Ireland, and Scotland. How many hills and valleys are gone? And we look at these. I mean, imagine if the American history was just from Ohio to Nevada.
Yeah.
And so we have this snapshot, and we get these stories. And the Nephilim. I went down the same road. And people are like, oh, there's giants. And it's like, does anyone want to deconstruct the language that's being used like you just did? I mean, I think you just summed it up perfectly. My only contribution is I can't believe how hard I'm revisiting the amount of hours I had to spend to confirm exactly what you found. Why?
All right, so just
well, I'll tell you, Jared, it's because your faith isn't strong enough and you've got to pray more.
Well, Father Flanagan, I do believe there's a young boy that could sit us down and change my religion.
I'll drink to that.
I'm right behind you, sir.
Right. So just to be clear, neither one of you think that there's a nemesis star out there with Nibiru flying around it that's on a collision course with the Earth, right?
Well, I do.
You
actually.
go ahead, Jared.
Well, okay, so there's been some astrophysicists, and I actually mentioned this in my book. I have a whole section about this, is that there is, in one of the many explanations besides having a binary star system, because most of what we've seen through in looking around the universe, there are habitable or estimatedly habitable planets, and of those, they have 2 stars. And so it's either that, or there are 2 astrophysicists that have theorized in recent years, based on polls on the entire solar system, ours that is, that there is very easily that missing planet, that there is a cycle that's 3,500 to 15,000 years, that it should be coming around, but that there could be Nibiru or remnants of it still in an orbital path. Based on that, there is mainstream scientific evidence for it. Whether or not the Annunaki, based all up on Sitchin's stuff that I think I just talked about recently on The Fringe, was just that, he helped inspire a lot of new alternative researchers. I think that's the most positive thing I can say about it. But the evidence that a group of aliens came that they could manipulate the human gene, and they could do interstellar travel, but they didn't know how to use atomic 3D printers and make gold. They had to come here and engineer humans to dig it up. Is just
right.
So there's a good example of humans mystifying something and or creating a story to explain why they're sitting on top of mathematically pie-shaped structures like ziggurats with hexagonal, base 60 math cuneiform tablets, and the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras, because it's been handed down from the ancient past. We're dealing with a society that's just parroting and echoing and mythifying something they don't know. So we can't. I only bring it up because we are so hard bent on still anchoring to the story we've been told about our past, rather than freeing ourselves and looking at where are we really from and what have we really found in the ground. What are the facts telling us? And we keep still trying to fit this, whatever we look at, we keep trying to fit it into the stories we were told, whether it's the Anunnaki, whether it's Nibiru, and the whole this story that we've been told, whether it's in the Bible, whether it's in any other religion. We keep relating to our past with alternatives only to this theory, which is my only point right now.
Man, you sound like me with very few alterations. You almost took those words right out of my mouth, because I would have said just in short that I don't know that I believe all the mythological hype or the mythos about Nibiru, but I certainly understand the scientific side, the astrophysical side of it, that there is something there. Now, we have named this Nibiru. Does that mean it's the same Nibiru of mythology? No, it doesn't mean that. But this is what we said, hey, what if that's Nibiru? I've heard people say. And so when it comes down to Sitchin's theories, I had too many problems with his scholarship. He was an academician, but his source material is his misinterpretations of things. And I understand where he was coming from, and he may have been onto some things, but at the same time, it's like, I look at just something as simple as, and I wrote about this, he used the word mu, M-U in the English, to mean the firmament. It was that ancient Mesopotamian word or Sumerian word, Sumer-Akkadian word for the firmament, the sky. And he uses mu to mean the conical shape of a nose cone of a rocket ship. And he calls it and this is where he gets his sons of the fiery rockets. And it's like you can't really extrapolate rocket out of mu, because mu is talking about the blue sky, the stars above it, and that's it. It's the firmament. And that word he mistranslated or put his own translation onto to mean nose cone of a rocket, the curved shape. Yet there was an ancient lexicon that existed from back at least 1500 BCE. You had a lexicon that was written of all these localized cultural languages in Sumer, Akkad, the Mesopotamian area, Assyrian, all of these different things that had a lexicon that compared all the words. Mu was on that lexicon. So Sitchin either missed that word or ignored that word or didn't realize the lexicon existed. And so this is where I started to struggle with some of the things he said. If you're building a whole theory on a mistranslation of a word, then maybe your theory is shifted off course somewhere. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, because and not to digress into a Sitchin beating.
Right.
But I found the same thing. It's like, okay, well, how is it that nobody has seen the cuneiform tablets that he's referring to?
Right.
And anyone basics here, because
anyone
there's and it's fun because it inspires everyone's imagination. At the same time, there something I didn't realize as I started looking at some of the ones we have looked at. There are millions. We think, oh, well, we figured out cuneiform. Well, that's in the bag. No, there are millions of tablets, and the assumption is, well, we translated the best ones first. How would you know that? There are millions of them laying there. There's online databases that if you want to learn it, people, you can actually start helping decode cuneiform tablets. This is a thing. You can actually participate, but there is no source material for it. And then again, it's a story. So, but here's the problem. If you tell a story for 1,000 years, it is a thing. So I acknowledge that that there was a story that was told that guided people either religiously or philosophically. They lived their lives, and for 1,000 years, 2,000, 3,000, there's some interesting history, and I believe all human history is worth exploring. However, if you got an archaeologist spending 30 years putting together a entry ticket to Disney World but never digging up Disney World, we got problems in archaeology. And when you're doing it with an archaeologist and not a interdisciplinary like a forensic geologist, or just I have a background in just period remodeling. So 140 years, 120 years, 100-year-old homes. And in that course of time, do you know how many people come in and repair things and change things? And when you do an addition, the structural loads, and we're staring at some of the largest monuments around the world that have similar construction methods, that have similar keystone cuts, the megalithic spheres, the cymatic polygonal construction, and then there's little pebbles on top, and we go, oh yeah, that was all built by the same people.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Sure. And again, everything we need to know. Now remember, the entire paradigm that we're discussing is of everything we found above water, because anything in the water is just a few hundred yards out. It's just really just an extension of the paradigm we're already telling you. Well, then why is there a city off of Cuba? You know, why are we dealing with that? But the Nephilim, I mean, getting back on it, we now have this semi-alternative downshift into giants. And I thought Malcolm Gladwell of Blink and The Tipping Point, he did a TED talk, by the way, about Goliath that I thought was very fascinating, because it was about his commentary. Like you said, it could be an allegory, it could just be a story, where he points out that Goliath was led out to fight David, that he was held on either side because he couldn't see. And that he said before David, come before me so that I might smite you, basically, in a nutshell, because Goliath had sight problems because he had some form of gigantism. And the reality is that it was said that the stone shooters, the ones with the slings, could hit a bird in flight with what is equivalent of a .45 caliber pistol.
Yes.
These were not the crap, this guy only has a slingshot crowd.
Right. A slingshot was a deadly weapon in battle.
These guys were shooting before you had guys shooting arrows but the slingshotters were invaluable. I mean, they could pierce armor. This was not going to win it deal. You got a guy that's possibly blind and big, but irrelevant. You got this incomplete alternative digression about, well, there was giants and here's what it is, but you're selectively editing out the word. And if you don't, I couldn't ditto it more based on what you said about the actual translation of what it means. And then there's a bit of a pickle there for you guys in corporate religious world. When you kept, here's the other thing, were they trying to intentionally deceive us? Well, they kept the entire religion in a language that no one could speak for how long until Luther came along?
Oh, right.
I mean, there's just so many things that add up to deconstructing, and you can believe anything you want, but at this point, when you look at the slivers of truth, okay, well, 10 feet tall is pretty tall. Yeah. And not only that, I think we talked offline about the Paracas. This is just one example of one people. Elongated skulls with suture lines. Their spinal column doesn't enter their body the same as ours. They have the arterial entries and exits under the chin and in the back of the skull are entirely different than what ours are, but they're human. And so the bottom line is, this is just one race that is found on every continent. These are not pressed together with boards, but born completely different than us. And how, if you want to go again with a theory like evolution, again, not supporting in our context creationism, we're not using this dialogue, but this is literally another example of right in our face, a race of humans that made it from Eurasia and Crimea to becoming possibly the first Mennonites and hanging out, making cool tapestry and living on the beach.
Yeah.
But we're stuck here with, we're still stuck in the lobby waiting, I think, for a conversation where somebody's waiting to give someone else permission to say, look, there's a narrative that we're telling ourselves when we go out and look for stuff, and we're trying to make the theories, the facts fit the theories, and we're throwing out the facts. Well, we could be a lot further along, I think, technologically and in our history, and murdering each other over philosophies if we would look at the facts and not the theories.
You know, and that is a big I wanted to say pet peeve. That's so vernacular, but you get what I mean. That's a big pet peeve of mine, is trying to squeeze things to fit the biblical narrative or religious narrative. I had a very good professor of mine. His name was Dr. Charles Ailing. He actually was the chair of history after he was my seminary professor. He was the chair of history at Northwestern University up here in St. Paul for 25 years. And he went on to become the president of the Near Middle East Archaeological Society. Very well-known, learned man, historian. And he told me at one point when I was writing my book on the Nephilim, he says, Scotty, just remember, he says, you've got to filter all your information through the Bible. And I said, Doc, if I do that, though, I said, I'm giving a biblical point of view. I said, wouldn't it be better as a researcher to step outside the box of the biblical narrative and see if the biblical narrative fits what I'm talking about? Historically, if it fits the archaeology, not if the archaeology needs to squeeze to fit into the biblical narrative. It was like I'm sitting for 10 days floating down the Nile, actually up. We were going south on the Nile River with a good archaeologist friend of mine and a bunch of archaeologists. One of them was the Sod, not Sod was his last name. That's the other guy. He's the head at Komombo, the head of the archaeological. For Pete's sake, what's the word? The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities. And he was their general inspector out of Komombo. And we're sitting on the deck of this dahabeah floating down the Nile. And I get up one morning for coffee, and he was very gregarious, and he yells, Scotty, me boyo! And he picked up boyo from John and I, because we use that because we're both Welsh and British backgrounds and so on. And Boyle, come over and have coffee with me. And he asked me, he says, I heard you the other day talking about your faith and how you believe you have lost this. What do you believe about this? And we had a long conversation, a couple of hours. And I actually asked him, I said, look, you are an inspector general for the Ministry of Antiquities in Komombo. And I said, you are a man of science. You're an archaeologist. You're a historian. I said, you are a devout Muslim. I said, what do you do personally when your faith conflicts with your science? I said, especially in Islam. And he kind of did this thing that I see a lot of Muslim men do. He closed his eyes, his eyebrows went up, kind of arched his eyebrows, shrugs his shoulders, and his hands go out, kind of like he says, so when I have conflict, he says, I just keep, my faith is over here, and my science is over here. And he says, I don't let them meet. And I said, you've achieved something that I can't do. And I said, this answers your question about any loss of faith I had. I said, when I have that conflict, I find it very hard to uphold faith when science tells me one thing over here that's completely different. And it's not that I have made science the surrogate for my God, which many people I think have done. Science becomes the new God. It's the replacement God for the God I don't want to believe anymore. I don't want to be a Methodist like my parents, and so I will be a scientist or a pagan, one of the two. And so I said, that's an unachievable goal for me. I said, I can't be blind to one and accept the other or vice versa. And so I think I heard this in some of what you were saying as well. There are just certain things about faith that, and I always have to put in this disclaimer, I'm not trying to be insensitive to anybody's personal faith. If you believe something by faith, and by God, believe what you believe, but know why you believe what you believe. And I did a big series on my own show, my own radio show. It took us about 8 weeks to get through it. Why do you believe what you say you believe? And we were talking about mysticism and Gnosticism and Christianity and Orthodox versus whatever. And it's like, don't say you believe something and then don't know why you believe that. So
have you been able to find a solution for that?
Oh boy, the solution that I think I have stumbled upon is probably a conversation all on its own. But what I have tended to do is say, I'm understanding that even the stuff I believed as it was my world was very small. The universe was very small because I believed in one form of faith, religion that encompassed everything. And then I found as I studied it more, and this is leading to your answer, is that it seemed to me that everything that I was reading and believing, this was their version of what they believed. And they weren't always consistent with each other, but they blended them all together in a series of books, which we now call the Bible. And the more I studied that, the more I found that there were a lot of mythologies that seemed to parrot other mythologies from other cultures and other religious backgrounds and other spiritualities. You look at the book of Genesis, and I'm sure you know this already, I'm not preaching to the choir here, but book of Genesis is like a repeat of the story of the Annunaki and the story of Enlil and Elil and Enki-Ea and all these other gods of the Sumer Akkadians. It's the same story, retold in a little different fashion. And so you say, which came first? Which was the original story? Or was there a proto-religion that birthed them both? And I was just talking the other day about how fourth millennium BCE was the way people approached religion was he was the god of the mountain, or the god of the thunder, or the god of the ocean, the god of the river, of the rock, of the tree, of the sky. And these were natural gods that people believed that these were the things that were behind everything. There was no personal religion. And then into the third millennium BCE, they started to merge that into the building of all these city-states and the protection of the people and so on. So the god became the god of the city, the god of, these things happen for your crops. These things happen for this, that, and the other. And then by the second and the first millenniums BCE, and we're talking this is all Mesopotamian to Assyrian, all these religions started to get the view of the personal God, the God that was there for me, the God that could save me, the God that could save my family and my crops, the God that loved me. And this, of course, ended up in your first century, first millennia BC, all the way down to, Christianity, Judeo-Christianity. And so my answer to all of that is that I started seeing a worldwide anthropological explanation for why we did things the way we did them, and the evolution of why we believed things the way we believed them, coming down to what we believe now. And just today, I was just talking yesterday and today about how the kings in ancient Assyria, Mesopotamia, these kings they became the sons of God. In the Assyrian vein, they were the sons of God, and they had to be perfect. They had to have this perfection about them. And we talked about what they did when the king was perceived to have sinned and troubled the gods. You can bring that evolution of that all the way down to what we think about presidents of the United States. They are to be blameless. They are not to have character flaws. The character flaws are the things that lead us to not trust them. And so all of that we're still in the tail end of the evolution of that. So you put that into religion, you put it into science. I think all of this stuff, that's the way I would answer your question, maybe a little more scattered than you would have liked it, but that's what it's boiled down to for me, is I have found that all of these stories are just that. They're the mythology that built what they had and what they believed, and as civilization moved on, they perfected that, only in use of the word perfected, by refined it to be what they want it to be as each century to millennia passed. Does that make sense? Did I answer that?
Yeah.
Or am I being too nebulous?
Jared, do you have a question?
Well, I think it's the same thing. We're having that conversation where I've said some of the same things. It's just there's enough problems in the world for a large group of people that involve getting through their day-to-day life and trying to understand the ups and downs of whatever their life is, dying, marriage, kids, you name it. Yeah. And they are not desiring to be in a position of answering the questions of why do they believe what they believe. They need to believe what they believe, and I'm on one hand constantly conflicted internally about if these people for the most part didn't believe what they believed, I believe there would be a lot more people killing each other.
Yeah,
that's ironic. I'm not trying to be rude about it, but the reality is that it creates societal order. And part of me has to wonder, after a massive cataclysm or after a fall of a great society, and I often wondered if pre-Younger Dryas, pre-12,600 plus years ago, if when we look at some of these cities that are under the water and look at like the Paracas and these people, these different humanoid forms that were clearly simultaneously living together, just like we have tribes today, was there a time where when it all fell apart, and after coming out of the bunkers or coming out of these rock-cut ruins that are all over the earth, possibly dwellings also, but the point is that how do you get to teach a portion of a surviving land-based roaming random human population that were caught in a cataclysm and or a war and or both, teach them to farm, give them something to hold on to, teach them love one another. There's many elementary purposes that are positive in faith that are not, and I'm not reducing it to this to be degrading or to be not positive in any capacity. These are all positive things that ultimately have helped people save each other, save their families, make great sacrifices, and understand those sacrifices. There's a million things we could digress on about faith. And this is just one of those times where, okay, well, it's up and running. But just like the Joseph Smith Mormon thing, where I'm going with this is that on one hand, it occurs to me that it would behoove an ancient human advanced survivors to dish out the religion, also to not have you dig around too much, or better have you help delete the things that, whether they found them or not. If you're going to remain on this planet and not be discovered, you need people to repurpose your high technology. You need people to dynastically take over Egypt and turn it into, or the Mayans. You need to take over the pyramids. You need to rebuild megalithic basalt structures with mud brick, and then every now and then have a 1,800 or 400 ton well-cut, razor-cut, polished block. And when you tell someone like Joseph Smith and the Mormons, there's a whole chapter of biblical history down in South America. Well, what happened when the Catholic Church went anywhere and everywhere besides burning and destroying?
Right.
And so so this is part of that. Well, if you have this group of advanced ancient humans that are still around, you got to wonder sometimes, are they being benevolent? Are they being helpful? Are they all on the same page? It doesn't seem like it. And then you go and light a fire under modern civilization in America to go head south. Are they going to preserve what they find, or are they going to burn it even faster than the church did for 500 years? So that's my only digression to add to the faith aspect, but not rioting further or killing each other over faith. I feel like I think there's enough movement at least in the European centers of things, where there is this, church attendance, and the idea of religion that we've had for the last 2,000 years seems to finally be, I want to say this politely, simmering, warming down to a point where it might be easier for a paleoanthropologist or archaeologist or a geologist to go to a interdisciplinary archaeological site and come up with a solution doesn't involve either the stars they directly see in the sky or something to do with the Bible.
Right.
And this is just a Western Hemisphere thing. Have you seen the same thing? It's as if the East and the West do not collide.
Yeah.
Not everything important started in the Garden of Eden, and then there were some silly things in Asia. They're not as old. They don't have a long history. Have you noticed that too?
I have seen that. And furthermore, on top of that, and something that was in my head, and I hope this is on the same vein, I have seen this evolution continuing even down into, or you could even call it a devolution of religion. I've seen this continuing down into modern day. I want to throw this in before I forget to say it. Somebody on social media who I don't know said something to me about, they put up some post about Jesus and said, well, Jesus was, the Oval Office we shouldn't respect anybody in there because Jesus was an anarchist too. And I said, no, I didn't know this guy, and I really didn't want to get into a conversation with him. But I hate those kinds of memes. Don't misquote something to me and leave it, because I might tackle it. And I said, I have a very different view of Jesus, and all due respect. I said, Jesus wasn't an anarchist. And he came back and said, well, of course he was because of that. And I said, no. I said, just look at simple passages about Jesus. I said, the most famous one of all, dealing with government. Jesus said, anybody got a coin? Give me the coin. He says, whose face is on this? And they said, Caesar. He says, well, there's my answer. Give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God that which is God's. And he went on to speak about the human heart and the human condition, salvation, salvific stuff. People have used the clearing of the temple where he forms a whip and tips over the money changers' tables. And he was an anarchist. I said, no. He was there with a mission. He was trying to preach the kingdom of God to people, the condition of people's hearts. What did he say as he was tipping over the tables? He said, This temple is a house of prayer, and you have made it a den of thieves. And he starts kicking over the tables. I said he was speaking to spirituality. Now, I only bring up those two examples for this reason, is that we've continued to do what we have seen down through the ages with all these questions we like to ask about origins, about spirituality, about Nibiru, about anything, archaeology, anthropology. We've watered down all of this stuff to mean what we want it to mean as opposed to what it meant in its context. And and when I say that these two stories about Jesus are being given to try to make that person relevant to a new political mindset. And I say, you can't do that. You can adapt it if you wish, but make up your own character, because this character didn't stand for the things that you say you wanted to stand for. Not from a faith standpoint, but from just a pure examination of the text. That's not what the text says about him. And so this came to mind as you were talking, because I think we do an awful lot of that. We want to change the texts. We want to change the factoids. We want to change all that stuff to fit what we want it to be and what we want to believe about something. And so we will make it. We'll squeeze it to fit. I found this in the whole ancient alien theory. It's not that I totally against it. I can't say it doesn't exist and that there's not a possibility for extraterrestrial or celestial beings to have existed of some kind that interacted with humans in the past, but I don't see them interacting now. At least maybe I'm just closed off to it. I don't know. But you look at all that stuff and you say, we try to make the stories fit. And why are we still taking the old stories and trying to adapt the old stories to fit the new thinking? Because we need to have some bolstering historical foundational fact, whether it be on a spiritual level or a science level or whatever. We want those facts to fit our narrative. And so I don't know. Maybe once again, I'm talking and I'm probably drifting off of the main point that you were making. But that's what popped into my mind as you were talking, is that that's what we do now. And I think that's the de-evolution of religion, probably.
Well, I think you parodied also what's going on in archaeology, where again I mentioned it a little earlier, but it's the same point. I think on alternative research like Göbekli Tepe, perfect example. It's 5% dug up. I'm just starting with it. 5% dug up, yet you've already determined that it's aligned with all the stars in the sky, and clearly it was nomadic people making a temple, but just a temple, because there's no indication they lived there. First off, none of you thought it was there. And secondly, you didn't know that it existed, so how are you making the assumption that it was only nomadic people? You have to start, right, with the very assumption of what you just said wasn't true, that, well, nomadic people didn't build big things. Well, it was just a ceremonial site. And let me guess, every single little big boob statue is a fertility goddess. It's not like ancient 8th grade and a dude looks at his buddy and goes, look, I made a clay figure with big boobs. Yeah. Right. It's always a fertility goddess. It's never the kid who hid the statue under the stairs and it stayed there. It's always something significant. And again, it's always here we are, 5% dug up. And you have half of everybody going, well, the stars in the sky were really important, and what we see was really important to people in the ancient past. And here's the problem. The assumption, I agree with you, possibly somebody from somewhere else may have come here and may come here, and that's totally fine. Is it possible that the majority of the things that we're seeing are ancient and actually human? More likely.
More than likely.
But for 60 years, for the time our pop culture puts us at flying saucers, and it has to be some alien investment in the planet. It's not based on all the technology we're seeing, highly interesting, advanced stuff that we may or may not have been personally involved with in this strand of humanity. Either way, you take a site like Göbekli Tepe, and again, assume that they're not looking further in the sky than the night sky, that it has nothing to do with aligning buildings. The highest and oldest, like Easter Island, there's about 1,000. Everyone likes to talk about the giant heads. The ones that are buried, there's only about 150 that were buried. And of those, do you know that approximately 150, 200 max of the oldest on Easter Island of the Moai are made of basalt. They're the hardest. They're near, there's polygonal construction on Easter Island, and the holiest thing on the island is a stone sphere, just like the ones in Costa Rica and Russia and China and all over the world. And
right.
So here we have other cultures coming along and adapting a site, just like Göbekli Tepe. Why is there river rock between the giant megalithic pillars? Why? Oh, well, they found the quarry where it's at. They got 5% of it dug up. Well, you found a quarry, and perhaps meandering nomadic people did find the site and added on to it. But I wouldn't be able to tell you that personally because you only dug up 5%.
Right. Where's what? Tell me when you've got at least another of the 95% dug up.
I like your averages, but that'll take 3,000 years at the rate they dig stuff up. And I agree. Part of it is I get it. You have a limited amount of technology, or based on the technology we have, we might lose something in the soil. We might lose something like, I'm talking about engineered soil all over the earth. Well, okay, so what about the foundational structure? Is it just that they pre-compacted it, or is it made out of a more complex residue? But we won't know that because, we don't have the technology. So we'll dig up some of it, but we don't want to dig up all of it. But I don't even think that's in the paradigm. I think it's just you're going at it, and the money and the ability, it ties into religion. It ties into how you're wording, how you have to word the book, and make sure you talk about it and contextualize it within the Bible. Make sure you contextualize this narrative into the story. Or if you're going to, whatever you find, by the way, no matter what you find, no matter how commonsensical the fact is, you better relate it to the most current and degreed perspectives, theoretical or otherwise. You better make sure your facts are spoken about in reference. You better reference the Bible. You better reference modern timelines and archaeology, and that alone could send us down a rabbit hole for 3 more hours.
Ain't that the truth? And by the way, speaking of a rabbit hole for 3 hours, do we have the ability to edit in a break here?
Yeah.
I've got to run away for about 2 minutes.
All right, hang on. We'll be right back on Conflict Radio right after this.
All right.
Welcome back to Conflict Radio. We took a little break there. Now, we were on discussions about ancient pasts, I guess, and how it all comes and falls in line with the Bible. But I'm also curious, how do the reptilians fall into all of this? There's a lot of Indian lore about reptilians, and supposedly there was a big war in ancient days in the Utah area that pushed them all underground. Now, have you heard anything about this at all, Scotty?
I have, and I have a very good Native American friend of mine, Reuben Fasthorse is his name. He's Lakota, teaches, he's a language revivalist. He teaches Lakota language, New York University. And he's from here he grew up on the Pine Ridge and the Standing Rock reservations out here. And so he is very well versed. He's taught me a lot over the years. We are toying with writing a book about the merged mythologies, and Jared, you'd appreciate this, the merged mythologies, Celtic or Irish mythologies of the Fae, of the fairy folk, the elementals, and the elementals in Native American culture.
Little people.
The wee folk. And so we've been talking about that, and so he doesn't mention much about reptilians, though he has talked about shape-shifting. He has talked about the different kinds of elemental types of creatures that exist. And so I haven't heard, per se, much about Native American culture on the reptilians, although, you can pull some of that vague references every now and then. But it seems the main thrust is more they will focus on elementals as opposed to reptilians, at least in my experience.
So where do the reptilians? Where's all that coming from?
I think you got a lot of, here we go again, kind of thing. You got a lot of that from Sitchin's works. There's a lot of what he wrote about that gives you, and Jared, you were talking about how they made these little clay statuettes and they had women with big boobs, and we never account for the fact that maybe they were just women with big boobs. It didn't have anything to do with fertility cults. Now, I've seen a lot of reptilian talk, the mythos of it, the culture of it, going back to artifacts found in Akkadian culture, Sumerian culture. See, this looks like a reptilian. So they were worshiping reptilians, or this represents reptilian overlords or reptilians that came and had taken over the planet, all the way up to Queen Elizabeth II and all the royal houses of Wales and so on. And I don't know that I buy any of that. I find it to be interesting, perhaps even exciting mythology. But do I find it to be real? I don't know. I wrote a book on reptilians, and I found that I started off examining. I didn't know much about it when my publisher said, "Hey, can you write a book on reptilians as a follow-up to Nephilim?" And I said, "Sure." And I got into it, and I found that I was less intrigued by the mythos of it all than I was by the psychology of it all. And I started digging into why we have taken ancient mythologies, which I remember reading, Enki and everything, the Abzu, the underworld, all of this had to do with reptilian culture, Enki came down, and because he holds two snakes and was in control of water, that it had to do with reptilians, and it was a precursor to the Genesis story with the serpent, a reptilian, and character Nakosh. And I started looking into all of this, and I found I don't find a whole lot in these stories that would say, even modern interpretations of cuneiform texts, that would say Enki had anything to do with a reptilian type of a creature. These are all things we've put onto those stories. And so I find, again, I look at what Sitchin had to say about it, I look at what people have written about it. When I was writing the book, I did a word search on reptilian aliens on Google, and I was in the middle of a paragraph, and I actually in the manuscript of the book it says, "I'm going to do a Google search right now and tell you what I get." Oh, look, I got 2.7 million entries for reptilian aliens, and the first 10 of those on Google, the first 10 were all. I swear to God, this is the truth. Every last one of them was a different website, unassociated with the one before, but they all had verbatim, word for word, the same story told about what reptilian aliens were, but no source points given for any of them, nor did any of them give credit to any of the other 10 websites. And I said, so we've got something that's floating around out there. So my book became more of a thing of, I gave an initial examination of what the mythos is, started digging into the psychology. I went as basic as you could get. I went Freud and Adler, the two, fathers of modern psychology. Freud had a tendency in his work the human has to look backwards to find source points and to find meaning in their life. And Adler said, we extrapolate into the future, that which we want to be, and we pull ourselves into the future. And that was his basis for how we make ourselves happy. And I started looking at these two icons of the founding of American, world psychology. And I said, they give us a pretty good picture of why one says we need this whole reptilian factor, and why we create these stories to pull us into something more hopeful. If you can pull hope out of the reptilian story, you know what I mean, is that there's something greater than us. And I have found the whole reptilian thing, and maybe you're going to have a totally, I can't put words into your mouth, Jared, because I don't know what you think about this stuff, but I almost find the belief, use that word in capital letters, the belief in reptilians to be one of those surrogates for a belief in God, or a belief in Jesus, or a belief in Mohammed, or any of these other great Abrahamic faiths out there. We've replaced it with this. This is something that there's a greater something out there. There is a reptilian race that wants to destroy us, a reptilian race that wants to preserve us, and they're fighting each other. It's like the great war in heaven between good and evil. And so this is what I've seen reptilian stories take on. Now, clearing all that off the table for a second, just with one brush of the arm, shove it all off the desktop and onto the floor, and say, is there a possibility that there are reptilian, extraterrestrial, celestial types of beings, or even terrestrial type of beings? It's possible. But do I have proof that any of that really existed beyond some guy's statue of a lizard figure with big boobs? I don't. And so it becomes very hard for me to latch into that as a anthropological, archaeological fact, as it is opposed to an anthropological and archaeological evolution of the belief systems of men, of the humans. So there it is in a nutshell. I could get a lot more detailed, but that's my initial thoughts on it.
All right. So what about inner Earth beings in general?
Inner Earth. Are you asking me, or do you want Jared to jump into this?
Well, Scotty, I'm just, if you could answer that.
Sure. Inner Earth. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by inner Earth beings, unless you're just referring to elementals.
Like a hollow Earth, like.
Yes, yeah. I do know this. Back when I was in the church, and Jared might recognize some of this from his Catholic faith, is that the elementals were spirit beings that, according to Roman Catholic theology, they were the spirits that in the wars in heaven were too good for hell, but too bad for heaven. So God gave them the earth as a domain. And this encompasses a lot of things that have become almost storybook characters for us. Fairies, the fae, the she, the banshee, the different types of beings, the leprechauns, and
even
all
Bigfoot,
of these.
right?
So all of these are part of that spirit world that is the elemental world. If you've ever seen a series that was done, it wasn't on TV. I think I saw it on either Netflix or somewhere like that. Amazon. It was Hellier, which was done by some people that know the Newkirks and Aaron. Why am I blanking on his last name right now? But some of them, he was associated with the Ghost Hunters at one point, and they did this little personal, very well put together. The production quality is really high. But these stories out of Appalachia about the elementals, and especially in this one little town, and in the caves and these creatures and so on. And
you're talking about the Moon-Eyed people.
Yeah, the Moon-Eyed people. I think I can't remember if they called them that in this, but it's the same type of thing. And something I have experienced, and I will say this. For all the high and mighty talk I do of science and wanting to make sure and doubting certain spiritual things and so on, I've had a lot of personal experience, which then becomes anecdotal experience, in the paranormal world, in the ghosty stuff, the spiritual stuff, the encountering things. If I may put it in the vernacular, I've seen a lot of shit, and I've experienced a lot to make me stand in the position of saying, I can't say it doesn't exist. As a matter of fact, I have to say it does exist because I've seen it, I've experienced it, I've touched it, I've talked to it. And I'm not too crazy, I'm not too wacky and out there as far as that stuff goes. I don't smoke too much funny business, and I don't have hallucinations. I don't need to see ghosts so bad that I will manufacture them in my mind because I want to explore, I want to study, I want to research. And so I've seen a lot of stuff. And so anecdotally, I will say, I know how to explain things away when I hear other people's stories, but my personal experiences are not something I can explain away because I experienced them. I'm not listening to somebody else's story and going, bullshit. I'm listening to my own stories and saying, these are things I've experienced firsthand. And so I don't doubt them. So I pull that over into my belief system on elementals and those kinds of things. I can't prove any of that exists. What I can prove is only to myself because I've seen things and experienced things. So what they are, who they are they reptilians? No, I can't say again, and again I'll be talking way too much and beating the dead horse with this, but I'll say, and then Jared can pick this up. I don't disbelieve that there's a possibility that they can exist, but I would like to see some good, solid evidence of them existing. Not just, look at this statue that's 6,000 years old. It's not going to pull it for me. That's not going to do it. You show me evidence of a reptilian culture. You can say, well, the RH factor in blood. Well, you know what? That doesn't mean it's reptilian. So here's where we have to start really... The rubber's got to meet the road for me. Okay, yeah. I'll stop there with that.
Jared, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I'll back up. Two things. One, I agree completely on the idea that it's become a religion. On one hand, it's people are looking for meaning, and I think that's an aspect to this that I've been critical of, that, or I guess in observing that people are looking for answers, and those answers often become a spiritual quest. So the idea of reptilians, or the idea of a disclosure from very benevolent, high technology aliens, or in the paranormal world, that there is this connection to the beyond, and the idea of taking reptilians or anything and either deifying it or even as a spiritual advisement that my life is guided, or that I'm seeking this through what shouldn't be a story. It should be the facts. I'm not saying your faith is. I'm saying that people are taking what may have been a story, calling it a fact, and then applying somehow in this full circle argument a faith aspect to something that is just a question of, are you finding evidence of this or not? And in the case of the reptilians, it's the same thing where you have this dialogue being created and then it's being perpetuated, and it often falls in circles where the dialogue on it being a thing is usually with the plot of Stargate and Deep Space Nine. It's right. Identical. Yes. And it's another good example of, and because you don't understand how nanotechnology works and that you can build anything you want out of an atom, the story falls deeply short. If you take post-flood mythologies about aliens or anyone coming and needing to engineer, mind you, they can genetically engineer humans, but they don't understand at the mitochondrial level, which there is scientific evidence that DNA, that Qigong, the Asian practice of Qigong, like Johnny Chong, there's been lots of specials on him. There's been a book done on him. This is a guy who can direct the electrical energy within his body in his manifestation of Qigong, which is an ancient Chinese practice, which again is just one example of one thing in faith or a mystification of a technology because it produces a similar result, but yet it was filtered through a religious lens, is an ability that, just like Wim Hof and the Iceman, and I've talked about before, these are not superhuman. They are human abilities that we forgot, that we mystified. And in Qigong, in his manifestation, he has this electrical current energy, which is done hypothetically down at, the theory goes that there's actual nuclear cold fusion happening at the cellular level. And this is something that we barely fractionally have our minds around, and yet we have this desire to label something as a deified ability, or that the earth is this grounds for heaven and hell to be debated over by beings that don't like it from either side or do, or these are all they're just side trails on what everyone walking around, if you're only 10 or 15% conscious, depending on the conversation, what about the other 90 or 85% that we once had? Because even by evolutionary standards, we only get something through a forced adaptation. So here we are with 10 to 15% consciousness, looking for answers. We've now filtered reptilians through a whole lot of mysticism. And what we're left with, like you said, is these statues that could just be from 5000 BC Halloween. And what kid like plays with cars or Star Wars toys didn't want to maybe make a little reptilian little like statue? Which does ask, I guess in full circle, commentary and everything otherwise, I got to ask you, in your research on reptilians, two things. One, you should name the book that you wrote for everyone. And two, in those statues that constantly get cited within a few different shows from Japan, did you look into those reptilian statues? Is that one of the examples you're referring to as reptilian statues, and they're not referring to anything? You know the statues I'm referring to? Yeah.
I do. If I'm not mistaken, now this is back in 2013, 2012, I put this book together. I'm trying to remember if I showed photos of those. I showed Sumerian, Mesopotamian statuary in photos. I'm not sure if I hit the Asian ones. But you would ask a question here at the beginning of that I just sidetracked myself on the answer. Restating
the Japanese statues, the ones that
the Japanese. No, I didn't do much about them. I didn't look into them very deeply. But there was something else you were asking at the beginning of that.
The name of your book.
Oh, my book. Oh, okay. Yeah, it was. I called it The Secret History of the Reptilians, which, by the way, my title was Reptilians, and my publisher changed it to The Secret History of the Reptilians. And so I gave it a fancy subtitle. It was something about why I can't remember the subtitle to my own book. It was the Secret History of the Reptilians, the pervasive presence of the serpent throughout human history, culture, and alien mythos. And that was the subtitle I gave it. And I tried to lightly examine all the different cultures that seem to have reptilian factors in them, and it was things like the Chinese dragon, all the way to Krishna and sitting atop the coiled serpent beneath the banyan tree, to Quetzalcoatl, the winged, feathered serpent god of the Mayans. And all of these different cultures, I tried to look into the different serpents, and I brought it all the way into the "Don't Tread on Me" flag. How we've got a symbol of the rattlesnake for patriotism, and that's my book, The Secret History of the Reptilians. And I don't know that I really answered that question as well as my publisher would have liked. It still seems to be a somewhat popular book, along with Nephilim, 7 and 8 years later. But it's very rudimentary, my examination of it, which is all I meant it to be. And because, like I mentioned in the earlier segment, that I was writing with a different purpose. So, I really like your approach, Jared, to this, your thinking on this. Probably while you're talking, I'm going, well, yeah, I should have said that too, because I think the same way. So,
because that's in my book. You heard it.
Yes, that's right. And I can speak to this as clearly as you could probably read it for yourself in my book for $22.95.
No, sir. After you. After you.
There you go. So I hope that answered your question, Jared.
Oh, yeah, but if people weren't clear on it, you could say it one more time. Oh, wait.
You could find it in my book.
Yeah, well, but only with that raving endorsement of
that's right.
Only been paranormal clairvoyance.
That's absolutely with that endorsement. So
awesome.
So what about? So I guess we're done making out about that. Well, next question.
So what about the elementals, Scotty?
Oh boy, what about them? What about them? I don't know that I could break them down into any kind of a scientific research study of elementals. You know, it's very hard to get them into a lab to find any kind of methodology that works to define them. It's all, to me, it's cultural stories. It's cultural, I could leave it there and say that's what it is. It's cultural tales. It's tales of superstition. It's tales of religion, spirituality, however you want to plug it in. However, due to, as I already mentioned, to some of my own experience in seeing and encountering and things like that, which, by the way, I will tell you, does fly in the face of my faithless stance these days. When I see something like that, my first response is, wow, that was really effing cool, but I can't acknowledge that. It flies in the face of my faithless stance. So there are things you see that go against the stand you want to take, which is one of, I want to be totally secular in my assessment of something, because if I start adding my spirituality to it or a faith belief in something, I believe I'm tainting my research. I'm starting to, and Jared, I know you understand this. You start applying faith to something, personal faith, you're tainting your research in that you are going to see it through the thing that you say, I believe by faith, which is a very powerful motivator for things that people do. And so, I want to step away from that but then I have experience. And so I have to call it anecdotal. And so what about elementals? I think that they exist. Can I prove they exist? No, not outside of personal anecdotal stories.
You think they're interdimensional?
Probably, most probably. If something can, let's say you've just got, let's use as an example, a hypothetical, a ghost. You're sitting at your desk and all of a sudden, poof, ghost of great-grandfather appears and moves the pencil box on your desk and goes, don't use these, and disappears. What do you do with that experience? It's obviously interdimensional because he's not there all the time. He's popped in and popped out. I know that there are some, and I will apply this to ghost hunting, and I can't speak intelligently to this because I'm not the person who does the research on it, but there's somebody that I know very well who's done a lot of research on this, done research into certain types of radiation and atmospheric differences when you have paranormal experiences. And he's not talking about the mind and how the mind works, but the physical, geographical area around somebody. And one of the things he noticed in a lot of his activity with people who are seeing or experiencing ghosts or picking up voices or doing clairvoyancy work or, mediumship is that there's a change. And he said it's almost as if there's a door opening and a door closing. And while that door is open, you're picking up fluctuations. And when that door shuts, it goes back to normal. Now, this is the way he described it to me, and I can't get more scientific because I was talking to him in an interview, and I didn't write all this thing down and research it. But So, I think you're dealing with probably something that's interdimensional, but something, I don't know. If you go into fiction and you look at a story like The Mists of Avalon, which talk about the great Isle of Avalon, which coexisted in the same moment on the Isle of Glastonbury in England, the Priest's Isle in the 4th and 5th centuries A.D., early Christianity, the White Christ. And yet, if you had the power and knew the incantations, you could part the mists, and the Isle of Glastonbury becomes the Isle of Avalon. And you're in a totally different dimension. So is there the possibility, call it string theory, call it interdimensional theory, that two things can coexist in the same place, only in different dimensions? Yeah, I think that can I explain that? No. Do I have the science ability to explain that? No. I tend to think something like that makes a lot more sense to me than just saying there's a ghost here or something. That there are things that exist on different planes and different levels, and they can occupy the same place in totally different dimensions. But I have no proof of that. I can't prove that to you.
And do you think we're headed towards a great awakening?
I think we've always been in a great awakening. I just think we close our eyes half the time. As I've said about the paranormal or the supernatural, I said I don't believe we live in a supernatural world, or that the natural world and the supernatural are separate. I believe they coexist at the same time. It's what you open your eyes to. Can you do that do you need chemicals to do that? Some people do. Does that make it a real experience? And is it actual? Is it scientific? If I have to use ayahuasca or scotch, aged 18 years in rosewood casks, my favorite, or do you, is it something that exists so viscerally that it can make itself known? Why do you have to be open to it? If it exists, it exists. And you shouldn't have to be open to it. If it exists, anybody could see it, right?
Yeah.
So what makes it work only if you're open to it, or you explore it, or open your mind, Kawato said, And if you know that reference, you get a gold star. And so that's what I think about that.
All right. Jared, do you have anything to add to that?
I do. Two girls with green eyes. And Brigadoon. I think that part of the fascination with our past is we get either a jingle, a song, something stuck in our head, or I do believe that in one of our lost technologies is genetic memory. I talk about that in my book, and part of it is, why are we so drawn to either, it's not just that a song per se is a ballad or a snappy tune. I think there are things that are laid deep in our genetic memories collectively, a human consciousness, and also how we could either through synesthesia project and or see or communicate, and our grasp on waves and frequencies, which has only recently become kind of Hans Jenny did cymatics, and there was, the book is not in current print, but it's out there, and it's, we're looking at work that's 40, 50 years old that actually goes back 300 years. But then we have an idea that from either the paranormal or in tying into this interdimensional idea, unless we experience it, actually traveling to and from, we are not entirely clear, I think, on the technologies that were once available to us, or ability to see or experience through all of our senses. We are kind of in safe mode. I know I've talked about it before, but it's a lot like a computer that's just pretty much broken, and we're in safe mode. We can still do basic function, but at 10-15%, I think the lenses that we experience, something snapping to and in and out of plain sight, or those are all open to interpretation. And the problem is when faith, or I guess I'm commenting and also observing the same thing on when you have this scientific side, you have a faith side. Whatever you believe, there's a point where when it exceeds your grasp technically and understanding it, there's either a desire to continue to ask the question, or I think there can be some desire to put it into the faith category because maybe you've thought it out as far as you are going to want to take it, or can, or don't desire to further. I think some people have those limits. Other people just can't stop asking the question why. And then you don't have to make a choice between your personal beliefs on one hand and your science. And then in these cases of these technologies, we keep we either experience, experiment, or view and observe a phenomena, and we assume it's alien, or like the Tic Tac, UFO encounters, which are documented by actual flight commander who flew alongside one. Yes. And this is no joke. This is a highly decorated commander in viewing definitely alien spacecraft, but it's not alien. I don't say definitely alien. I'm judging it to be of a technology beyond anything the United States or any other high-level government in this world would have possession of. So what are we looking at? Well, we can project some ideas on it and have a conversation, just like it's become popular. Where I'm going is that interdimensional or Stargate, again, back to the plot of the movie. We tend to try to label the technology that we're seeing. And there's the other thing. We're not understanding that this technology, to us, technology is external or it's implantable. We're not understanding that this technology is also biological. That the idea, I mean, Harvard scientists wrote a 50,000 word book on the human genome using the letters of our genes as the ones and zeros, and then they moved on. They essentially could record all human knowledge in two creatures aside. Basically, two elephants could contain all the genetic code, which would indefinitely last all human knowledge. And you would still be an elephant, and you would still be thirsty, and you would still wander wherever an elephant wants to go. But genetically, we're not understanding that a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of what we're missing as we're debating the fertility goddess in the ground, to these ruins, to the things that we're seeing in our myths and legends, that it does also tie to a living, not just a geometry of structure, but of our actual genetic abilities that we are chalking up to, well, that's crazy. That person just lifted a car off the baby. Or why did Wim Hof just climb Mount Everest in shorts and nothing else, or run 26 miles barefoot in shorts? Well, that's a trick, or that's neat. No. Those aren't just external or physical abilities or parlor tricks. There's things that we have programmed ourselves to do that you have to start with. I think that there's a hierarchy to the way we're looking at everything we're talking about. And I think the mystery that everybody's looking at, which is exactly the way a paramedic goes into an, I did not know this until I had a friend in a very bad accident, but paramedics show up and you could have glass sticking out of your arm, and they don't care. The first thing a paramedic does is, for those that don't know, is they have to identify the things that's going to kill you the fastest. And it might not be the tube sticking out of your gut or the glass out of your arm. It could be internal bleeding or a head injury, something internal that they can't see. And after they address these different layers, you finally get to the giant piece of glass that you think that they would take out that they can see, but they're not concerned with that yet. They have to start with the primary core functions of the body. And I think archaeology and our history is the same way, where you have to start with things like the Paracas of Peru and acknowledge simultaneously, in the last at least 9,000 years, we have a race of humans that are not built like us, and they show up in Egypt and in Bulgaria and in China and all over the world. We're seeing right down to these are not us, but it's part of that. How do we triage and make our past and our future? And if you see something that looks interdimensional, that's where I'm tying this to. And these abilities are all relational to a lost period of time where command of our genetics and of abilities that we didn't know were technical had nothing to do with holding an external device. It was literally a thought process. And here we are left with these interdisciplinary or hobbies of, well, this is paranormal, and this is scientific, and this is religious. And the catch is that the people who are devout believers, not researchers, but believers in each of these fields, because of maybe a personal experience, are in reality all catching pieces of a truth, but through the lens, it's been either mystified or due to repetitive results, they've identified it or misidentified it with a science where by all descriptions looks like it's a fact, but in reality they've described something but don't actually know what it is, but it repeats the function of it's repeating, it's the characteristics of the description, but it's not actually what it really is, like magnetism, for instance. And this is just all part of this rabbit hole that I decided to not shut up about right now. Here we go.
Scotty,
I like that, by the way.
Yeah.
So before you ask that, you mentioned rather flippantly or comically Brigadoon, and there's a quote, and I don't know how right I will get this quote, but Robert A. Heinlein, who is a science fiction author, the late Robert Heinlein, he wrote some one very amazing episode of the original Star Trek, which won an Emmy, The City on the Edge of Forever. And but in his magazine book, Glory Road, he said something. One of the characters said, "Does anyone ever get two chances? It says, is the door in the wall always not there the next time you look? Where do you catch the boat for Brigadoon?" he said. And so I think I understand everything you are saying, Jared, and man, there's very little there's nothing I disagree with. I'd have to probably listen again and go, aha, I have found something I disagree with him with, maybe, but, 'cause everything you're saying I agree with, and everything you're saying are thoughts I've had. And so I look at this and I say there is that scientific side where maybe the things we see and encounter, our anecdotal experiences, are just science that we can't explain yet, or we don't know how to explain, or we are unaware of. There is a scientific answer, I think, to everything. I think there's a scientific answer to spirituality. But there is that big question. Why does it seem that there's no boat to Brigadoon? There's no passageway to find that. It happens, and then you wonder, am I going to get another chance to see that same thing? Something even I used to talk about the patriarchs in the Old Testament. We think guys like Abraham, he had such an amazing life because of all the experiences he had with God. And yet when you add them all up, he had a couple of minutes of experience that didn't start till he was over 100 years old, and he didn't have another one ever again. And you think, is this a guy, some of these people, some of them we can chalk up to mythology, but are some of these people who have these experiences, are they the people who, or are they the people that have an experience and they live the rest of their life kind of empty because they can never reattain that same experience again? What does that make the experience? Was the experience a real thing that happened to them? And they're just so transitory is not the word. They don't happen often enough for it to be something where you say, I'll just have another experience next week, and it'll verify that. Well, many times, some of these people, and some people with experience, can go through the rest of their lives never experiencing that same thing again, but they're convinced anecdotally that it was. I look at somebody like Whitley Strieber, who wrote the book Communion, and then I think the second one was Transformation. Then he wrote a bunch where he started getting away from his alien abduction or experiencer experiences and got into more a philosophy of things. And he lost me a little bit when he did that. But his initial story, he was interviewing me once over the Nephilim book that I wrote. And I said, Whitley, you're a crackpot. And he kind of chuckled and he says, how do you mean? I go, you're a crackpot in that you have experienced something that nobody else has experienced. And you're the Moses to the burning bush. You might be, I know exactly what I saw and who was talking to me, but somebody else might go, you're right, burning bush. And, that might be their response to it. Yeah, right, aliens.
Yeah.
So, but I said, you're the crackpot because people think you're nuts, because you had this experience when maybe you did have that experience, but I didn't, so I don't know of it firsthand. And so hopefully that ties in. It segues well into what you were saying, Jared. But there you go,
Scotty.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, we're out of time. Scotty, you want to tell everybody where they can find you?
Oh, sure. You can find me. My website, real easy, ScottAlanRoberts.com. And Alan, I have to spell this out because there's 300 ways to spell Alan, is ALAN. So ScottAlanRoberts.com. You can find links to all my social media there and all the books I do and all that stuff. And I think my phone number's even there if you want to call me at 3 in the morning.
Yeah, and you got a great YouTube channel. You want to tell everybody what the name of it is?
Sure. Just Scotty Roberts. You go to, or Mr. Scotty Roberts. You go to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty with a Y, Scotty Roberts. So Mr. Scotty Roberts.
Yeah, it's a great YouTube channel. I recommend everybody check it out. Before I let you go, I want to ask you one last question.
Yes, sir.
You're a religious man?
I used to be. I probably am more than I like to admit I am now. But yeah, I'm not adhering to any. I call myself a stalwart, dyed-in-the-wool agnostic.
Do you think that God is a woman or a man?
I don't think God is either, but I think he has had manifestations of both. I know there's no time to really talk about this, but you look at the Shekinah glory in the Old Testament. Moses calls down the presence of God to sit on the Ark of the Covenant out in the wilderness, and it's the Shekinah glory. Shekinah in the Hebrew is a female, generically female term.
Yeah, and creation
there was
is
a goddess.
Feminism. Creation is feminism.
Yeah, the Holy Spirit, I think, is the female essence of God.
All right, and we'll be right back on Conflict Radio right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. Well, that was an interesting conversation. What do you think, Jared?
That was absolutely wonderful and fascinating.
Yeah, I don't think we really had our questions on the reptilians answered, but I guess from what he's saying, he doesn't really believe in them.
I think it's a question of the information in the ground. I think he definitely had theories enough to explain and worthy enough for the book that was written, and the facts in the ground I think are still open to interpretation.
It was a fascinating conversation, regardless. Jared, do you want to tell everybody where they can find you? And we're going to go ahead and just wrap up the show.
Yeah, it sounds great. I am at www.notaliens.com. You can get a signed copy of my book there. You can also find me on Amazon. It's Not Aliens, Worse, It's Us, Discovering Our Lost History. That is there on Amazon. I do have a YouTube channel also, Not Aliens. You can go to YouTube and look for Not Aliens. I'm there. I do try to keep up with it. But those are the places to find me right now.
Awesome. And just to let everybody know, you'll be joining us again, I guess in about 2 weeks. Well, no, a week and a half. We're going to have Michael Cremo back on. So that'll be a good time.
Yeah, that should be a great conversation
again. You looking
again.
Forward to that?
I'm absolutely looking forward to it. There's so many places that Michael has been, and with his new book out and this continuing rediscovery of our past, it'll be a great conversation.
Awesome. And we'll be back on Thursday on Conflict Radio with Richard Sirott. Remember, you can always find us on the internet, www.conflictradio.net. You can also find us on all of your normal podcast catchers, including iHeartRadio and Apple iTunes. Until next time, batten down the hatches and be safe.